Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Alhamdulillah, this is now episode 20, or sorry, episode 21 of the podcast The Forward with myself, Brother Mahdi Locke. And today I'll be doing another session on lessons from the Qur'an. And today I want to focus on migration, the truth about migration in Islam, because this is a huge issue. It's all over the news. It's been on the news it's been part of the news for the past 2 years or so. And no one has actually, I think, clarified. I have put out a few articles. I have written a few Fatawa legal rulings from scholars in Syria and other places saying don't migrate to the West, don't go to Germany, don't go to France, don't go to Sweden. I've got those. I also have my article, The Abodes of the Earth, but I think it's about time I did this as a podcast and presented this. So what I want to do in this podcast is I want to explain what it says in the Qur'an about migration. I want to look at the commentary on the Qur'an. I'm going to rely on Tafsir al-Wasit by Imam Muhammad SAW, who died 2 years ago. May Allah have mercy on him. It's a brilliant tafsir. He breaks every few verses down into lessons and what can be drawn from them. And then I want to talk about some of the other factors connected to the quote-unquote migrant crisis or refugee crisis that's happening now in Europe. And it's also spreading to Canada and to the United States, so that we understand what is going on and how Muslims should understand this. So where we're going to start is we are going to look at the fourth chapter in the Quran called An-Nisa, Women, Surah An-Nisa, and we're looking at the fourth chapter, verses 97 through to 100. So Imam Muhammad SAW, who was a brilliant legal scholar, wrote copious works on comparative fiqh, comparative law within Islam, and then he also wrote on international law, and he wrote on theology. He wrote on so many issues. I've got his comparative fiqh book behind me. It's 14 volumes. His longest commentary on the Quran is 17 volumes. The one I'm referring to now is another one he did, which is only 3 volumes, like an abridged version. So he starts off and he takes these verses and he calls this section the virtue of migration for the sake of Allah. So what we want to establish here, and this is whether you're a Muslim or not, you're listening to this, what we want to establish here is why do Muslims migrate and from where to where. So Imam Muhammad SAW, he starts off and he says that a Muslim in this world is required to worship Allah the Exalted alone and no one else. That's what a Muslim is commanded to worship Allah alone. And he's also commanded to manifest the signs of Allah and to exalt in the outward manifestations of Islam. Meaning, this has to do with pride or arrogance. What it means is that a Muslim is commanded to show that he's a Muslim. You wear certain clothes, you manifest this through praying 5 times a day, through going to the masjid, i.e. the mosque, through fasting, through paying zakat, through going on hajj and so forth, being seen, reading the Quran and so forth. There are ways that we manifest Islam. We celebrate Eid as well. This is what Muslims are commanded to do. It's not a in your closet, behind closed doors religion. This is not what it is. And this is something I've mentioned before in previous podcasts that people need to understand. It's an admission that we have to make as Muslims in the English-speaking world. Islam is not just this private religion. Islam is much more than that. It's like we say, it's a way of life, and it has a governance system. This is a very, very important point to make, and I will be going over this in today's session. This is like really crucial information. Imam Muhammad SAW continues. He says, if a Muslim is not able to carry out what Allah has commanded or to manifest these signs, these outward manifestations of Islam in a certain land or a certain country, such that in the case of, say, freedom of religion being denied in certain parts of the world, then he must migrate. He must perform what's called Hijrah. He must migrate from that land and seek residency or settle or seek to settle in another land that allows him to do so. And then he continues, he says, and Allah the Exalted has said this, has said the following, clarifying the obligation of Hijrah, the obligation of migration. So The verses are as follows. This is verses 97 to 100 from the 4th chapter. The angels ask those they take, while they were wronging themselves, what were your circumstances? They reply, we were oppressed on earth. They say, i.e. the angels, was Allah's earth not wide enough for you to make hijrah elsewhere in it, i.e. wide enough to migrate somewhere else? The shelter of such people will be hell. What an evil destination. Except for those men, women, and children who really are oppressed and do not have any other possibility and are not guided to any way. It may well be that Allah will pardon them. Allah is ever pardoning, ever forgiving. Those who make hijrah in the way of Allah will find many places of refuge on the earth and ample sustenance. If anyone leaves his home, making hijrah to Allah and His Messenger, and death catches up with him, it is Allah who will reward him. Allah is ever forgiving, most merciful. So those are the verses. And now we continue. So I will continue to read from the tafsir now of Imam Muhammad SAW and just translate it for you from Arabic into English. So he continues and he says, Imam Bukhari has related, this is the great hadith scholar, Imam Bukhari has related from Ibn Abbas that there were people from amongst the Muslims who were with the idol worshippers in a battle. Right? So you had Muslims versus idol worshippers in a battle, and there were Muslims who were obviously living in Mecca, and they were actually fighting on the side of the idol worshippers against the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, against him and the Muslims. And then one of them was struck by an arrow and killed, or one of them was struck in the battle and killed. And Allah sends down the verse. The angels ask those they take while they are wronging themselves. So this person is wronging himself because he's fighting on the enemy side and he's killed. So this is what the first verse referring to. The second verse, one of the following verses, we have those who make hijrah in the way of Allah, verse 100. It's related from Ibn Abi Hatim and Abu Ya'la with a good chain of transmission from Ibn Abbas, who said that Damra bin Jundab went out from his house as an emigrant. He's a muhajir, and he said to his family, carry me and take me out from the land of the idol worshippers to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because you have to remember, when these verses are being revealed, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is living in Medina, and Medina you have what's called Dar al-Islam, and this is why if you refer to the article "The Abodes of the Earth," this explains what it means. This is a place where the Muslims have territory, they have a community, and they have a governing structure. So it's these three components. There's a territory that they rule over, they have a community, and they have a governing structure. And it needs to be made clear that Medina is not, there is no Battle of Medina. There was no, hostile takeover of Medina. Medina, the people became Muslim through preaching and presenting the faith, which is how it's supposed to be done, because that's what creates a long-lasting effect. Forcing people from some sort of top-down approach, as certain people in the West are trying to do, does not produce any fruit, and certainly not any long-lasting fruit. So Damra bin Jundub goes out from his house. He dies on the way before he reaches the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he dies before he reaches Medina, and then the revelation comes down. Those who make hijrah in the way of Allah, if anyone leaves his home, making hijrah to Allah and His Messenger, and death catches up with him, it is Allah who will reward him. Allah is ever forgiving, most merciful. So, Imam Muhammad SAW continues. He says, it is known that hijrah from Mecca to Medina, migrating from Mecca in the beginning of Islam, this is before, that is known that hijrah from Mecca in the beginning of Islam, before the Feth here means before Mecca was taken over, before Mecca was made part of Dar al-Islam, right? And again, this was like a bloodless takeover. Mecca more or less surrendered. Was an obligation. This was an obligation to before Mecca was taken over. It was an obligation to migrate to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to migrate to where he is. So some Muslims migrated, in the first case, to Habasha, to Ethiopia. This is very, very interesting because, again, this is before Dar al-Islam exists. There's a Muslim community in Medina. Muslims are being persecuted in Mecca, so they leave. Some of them leave and they go out to Abyssinia or Ethiopia, where there is a just Christian ruler. And there's a lot of fiqh to derive from that. There are rulings that you can derive from that. That, you know, if you can live somewhere, the ruler's not a Muslim, but he's just, and so on and so forth, then you can reside there. But ideally, you want to be living in a Muslim land, and this is what we're going to get to. So some Muslims migrated to the first migration to Abyssinia, and then others migrated with the Prophet ﷺ to Medina, to Munawwara. However, there were some Muslims who stayed in Mecca out of love for their homeland and preferring the life of this world and what it has to offer. Okay. Now, the Imam here is making a very, very good point. And what we're getting at here, and this is why I would refer to the listeners to, if you refer to my article, The Abodes of the Earth, and if you refer to an article, I'll put the links below. There's an article I wrote in December 2015 called Why Do They Support Trump? Now, what has happened with regards to Europe and the Anglosphere ever since 2001, this is going back a long way, 2001. In 2001, we had a certain phenomenon emerged in the United States, started in the United States, and I think it was accelerated by the events of September 11, 2001. But we had this phenomenon called fiqh of minorities, and again, I'll put links below regarding this, which basically said that Muslims living as minorities outside of the Muslim world, for example, in Europe or in the Anglosphere, Muslims living in these situations, because it is quote-unquote difficult in certain situations, therefore Muslims in these countries can have their own set of laws. They can have their own jurisprudence because of the difficulties therein, because they might be persecuted, because they might be mocked, they might be ridiculed, they might be oppressed, people might do things to them, and so on and so forth. And the response that was given by Muslim authorities, and again, Imam Muhammad SAW, whose tafsir I'm quoting, this is someone we refer to as a Muslim authority. This is someone who speaks from the highest level. Another authority is Imam Muhammad SAW, and when he caught wind of this, when he found out that this is what was going on in the United States and other parts of the Anglosphere in Europe, this idea of having a separate jurisprudence, a separate set of laws for Muslims just because they're living in what is called Dar al-Kufr, just because they're living outside the Muslim world and they're facing, certain adversity. He completely nullified it. He spoke out against it, and he quoted these exact same verses that we're quoting right now from Surah An-Nisa, especially Ayah 97. He said, why? He said, if Muslims are having difficulty implementing their faith in the United States or Canada or Britain or Europe or wherever, leave. If you're having difficulty manifesting your faith, practicing your faith in these countries, leave. That's why these verses exist. Get up and leave. You don't create some new sort of fiqh. And again, the evidence from the prophetic biography is the same thing. When Muslims had difficulty in Mecca, they're being persecuted in Mecca, and they're having difficulty manifesting their faith. What did they do? They migrated. They went to Abyssinia, a group of them, and then later on they went to Medina. They left. Now, why did they do that? They didn't stay in Mecca and say, well, let's just make our own little fiqh here, make our own little legal system here, so that we can fit in and get along and not cause too much trouble. No, they left, and that's why. And you can read this all on my blog. He made that famous pronouncement back in 2001 where he said, we thought, he said, we were under the impression all this time that Islam was spreading in the West. That it was the fastest growing religion, and people in the United States and in Canada and Europe, they were just embracing Islam in droves. But now we see the reality, which is that Islam is actually being dissolved and disintegrated into the dominant civilization, into Western civilization. It's just dissolving and disintegrating, and the Muslims there just don't know what they're doing, and they're losing their faith, they're losing knowledge of their religion, they're losing knowledge of the Arabic language. And again, I talk about this in places on my blog, and I also talk about this in my upcoming book called The Big Step. And again, so what's happened, this is before I go back to Imam Muhammad SAW statement, and what's happened is since that time, since 2001, people like Imam Muhammad SAW, Imam Muhammad SAW, and other scholars, theologians and jurists, based in Damascus especially, have really had little sympathy for Muslims living in Europe and the Anglosphere. They've just said it over and over and over again. Get out, get out, get out, get out. Go back to the Muslim world. Find a Muslim country. I've got Fatawa on my blog about going to Germany, going to France. There's one fatwa I've linked to my blog. I translate it. It's on the Nassim Hasham website, where a Muslim living in Sweden, says, I have a job and it's halal. I mean, it's lawful. There's nothing unlawful, nothing haram involved in it, but it pays very little. Is it okay if I get a higher paying job that has a bit of haram in it? I mean, something to do with interest or usury or selling alcohol or whatever. And the response, and I believe this was Imam Tawfiq, Muhammad Tawfiq al-Bulti, the son of Imam Muhammad SAW al-Bulti, his answer was, a little halal is better than a lot of haram. If you have a little bit and it's halal, it's better than a lot of it being haram. And then he said, I hope that you find a good job in the Muslim world. That's the answer. Instead of all these little, because again, Muslims have all these issues. And you see this again, all these issues about, I try to get a job here, but there's interest involved. I try to get a job here, there's alcohol involved. I don't get time off for Friday. I don't get time off for Eid. And the answer you're going to get from these ulama living who are based in Syria and other parts of the Muslim world, their response is, well, get up and leave. I mean, if this society doesn't suit you, if it clearly doesn't suit your needs as a Muslim, why are you there? Why are you there? So this is what Imam Muhammad SAW says. He says, some Muslims stayed in Mecca because they loved their homeland. Okay, this is a really, really amazing point. They loved their home. Again, this is an excuse you're going to hear. You're going to hear Muslims who live in the Anglosphere or Europe, they live in Britain or Canada or America, they're going to say, but this is my country. Look at me, I have the passport, I have the American passport, I have the British passport. This is my country. Listen carefully. The Muslims in Mecca were Arabs. The Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, he said, Ana a'rabukum, I am the most Arab of you. Because again, the Arabs go back to Ismail. Ismail is the son of Ibrahim. He's the son of Ibrahim alayhi salam. He is seen as the father of the Arabs. That lineage goes back thousands of years, literally thousands of years. Okay, we're talking the range of 4,000 years. So the Arabs in Mecca, and especially the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because his lineage is direct, going back to Ismail alayhi salam, his attachment to Mecca, and especially, but the companions in general, the Muslims in general, those Arabs in Mecca, is the strongest attachment anyone can have to a piece of land, I think, in history. I mean, who can say that they have lineage attached to one plot of land going back 4,000 years? Well, I mean, I'm half English. My English lineage goes back 1,000 years, or I think like to 1066. And I've left England. I've left England because I've recognized this truth. I've realized this truth. But the Muslims in Mecca, their lineage goes in that land goes back 4,000 years. Their ancestors and the ancestors of their ancestors and the ancestors of their ancestors. It goes back 4,000 years. So, and they're being censored for this. But Allah is telling them, get out. Get out. Don't sit there and say, well, this is my homeland. I want to stay here. Allah is saying, get out. Who cares? If you care about your faith, you're going to get out. So, if people who are from that land, they're Arabs and they're from that city and they've been there in terms of their family and their lineage and their tribe, they've been there for 4,000 years, and they're being told, get out for your faith. Who are these people now, these Muslims now in the West, who are like first-generation immigrants, second-generation immigrants, third-generation immigrants? This is my country. You came in the 1970s. You came in the 1950s. You came last week. How can you say that this is your homeland and therefore this is your right? And this passport stuff, like I have the passport. No, we need to get this clear. Having an American passport does not mean that you are as American as John Wayne, or having a British passport does not mean that you are as British as Winston Churchill. If I moved to Pakistan and got a passport, that would not make me just as Pakistani as Iqbal. Okay, we need to think about this rationally. It's simply not true. So, love of your homeland is not an excuse. It's just not an excuse. And the other thing he says, Imam Muhammad SAW, is preferring the life of this world and what it has to offer. And that's true, right? I mean, this again, Muslims I'm guessing a lot of these people, they want to live in America or Canada or wherever, or Europe, because these are first world countries. The standard of living is higher, and I think this should be admitted. There's a lot of welfare to offer. There's a lot of welfare on offer, a lot of benefits, a lot of free stuff. So these are the people that are being censored in this verse. Imam Muhammad SAW continues, and he says again, amongst the Muslims living in Mecca, there are also those who are weak, who are not able to migrate because of an illness, because of old age, because they don't know the way. Because again, this is well before the age of planes and trains and so forth. If you want to go to Medina, you had to know you had to know the way. You were to go by foot or by camel. You had to know the way. And then there were also those who went out, they migrated, they made the intention, they went out, and they died on the way. And therefore this verse came down to clarify the rulings regarding all of these people. Okay, so Imam Muhammad SAW continues. He says, in the first category are those who died in the abodes of idolatry in Mecca, and the angels took their spirits while they're in that state, oppressing themselves, and while they were pleased to be residing in the abode of idolatry and preferring the dunya, what it has to offer, its fleeting treats and delights, over giving victory to the truth and supporting and helping the Messenger of Allah and accepting him, and their acceptance of oppression and being constricted. Right? They're actually, because these people, they're accepting being constricted. They're accepting living in a constricted state, hiding their faith, not really manifesting their Islam, not really talking about it, and not being allowed to manifest their deen as they wish to. Again, this is what a lot of Muslims in the Anglosphere in Europe are going through in some cases. You're not allowed to fully manifest your faith, you're not allowed to say certain things, you're not allowed to dress in a certain way, and you're just accepting it. The Muslims are out there just accepting it, like, oh, it's okay, whatever, it's normal. And they're being censored for this in this verse. So the angels say this to them as a way of rebuke and censor when they hit their souls. They say, what were you doing with regards to your faith? Why did you leave off Hijrah? Why did you leave off migration in order to actually give victory to Islam when you were able to do so? So, and again, what we're learning here, and this refutes certain people, I know there are certain people in the West who are not Muslim who like to think that Hijrah is connected to Dawah, in the sense that Hijrah means you migrate to Dar al-Kufr, you migrate outside of the Muslim world. You go to countries that are not Islamic to preach the faith. No. Migration, Hijrah in Islam, is always from Dar al-Kufr to, especially Dar al-Harb, because Dar al-Harb is the branch of Dar al-Kufr where Muslims are actually being persecuted and they can't manifest their faith. So migration is always from there, Hijrah is always from there to Dar al-Islam. And again, we have people in this day and age who, there are Muslims again who try to play this down and say, well, these statements, Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Kufr, they were just later additions to Islam, they're really part of it. No, this verse is so important. Imam Muhammad SAW, when he's talking about this verse, he says, when the angels say, is the earth of Allah not vast enough so that you can immigrate therein? Well, why are they saying immigrate therein? From where to where? The angels are saying emigrate. That clearly indicates a point of departure and a point of arrival. It's clearly implied in the verse. What are they? It's Dar al-Harb, where Muslims are being persecuted. They're living under non-Muslim rule. They're being forced to leave, and then they're going to settle in Dar al-Islam. So they're accepting this situation, and there's something else to raise here. There's a side point to raise here, which is in the fatwa. There's a fatwa in the article of the Abodes of the Earth. There's a fatwa that I quoted by Imam Muhammad SAW, and he makes this point about the brain drain. This is another important point that people don't realize, is that especially when we have skilled Muslims, the Muslims who have the high IQs, the Muslims who are the doctors and the engineers and the entrepreneurs, when they move out to America or Britain, you're helping the American economy, or you're helping the America as a country. You're helping them raise their standard of living, or Britain or Canada, wherever it is. When you could be helping your own country, you could be helping a Muslim country. This is a problem. This is what it means when we say that you're increasing their sawad, you're increasing their multitude, not just in terms of pure numbers, but you're increasing their standard of living, and the way they live, and the comforts and luxuries that they enjoy. So the Imam continues. Imam Muhammad SAW continues in his Quranic commentary. The angels will say to these people, why did you leave off migration and helping Islam when you could have? Why did you do it? And they'll make an excuse, and they'll make a false excuse, and they'll say we were oppressed and we were humiliated in Mecca, and we weren't able to establish our religion and the obligations. So this is an excuse people are going to make. Well, it was really hard. It was really hard. I couldn't fulfill my obligations because of the society around me, and there's so much disbelief and idolatry and sin all around me, and I couldn't do it. And then the angels will respond to them and say, wasn't Allah's earth vast enough so that you could migrate to somewhere where you could do so? And that's the truth. It is vast enough, but you preferred to be humiliated, you preferred to be oppressed, you preferred the life of this world over giving victory to the truth, and therefore the outcome of these people is hell. And what an evil end. Quite straightforward, I think. So, Imam Muhammad SAW continues, and he says, this shows us that the Muslim must flee with his religion to where he is able to establish the bounds of his religion and his obligations according to what Allah has commanded. Whoever migrates for the sake of Allah will find in the earth a place of refuge, an appropriate place of refuge, in which there is goodness and there is abundance and there is provision and there is respect and might. And this is all to make you desire migration. If you make that sincere intention and you want to live somewhere where you're safe with your faith, Allah will make it easy for you and He will provide you with what you need in that place. So this is the first category of people. The second category of people are those who are genuinely oppressed, and they're those who have a genuine excuse, such as old people who are very old, a very old age, people who are weak, people who women and children, those who are infirm. These are the people who Allah will forgive, and He will not take them to task for residing in the abode of idolatry and leaving off migration. And this also tells us that leaving off Hijrah is a big sin. It's a big sin. To leave off Hijrah is a big sin. But you might have an excuse. So certain people have excuses, like if you're not capable of doing so. And this just makes it sound really, really weird. It's like, because, again, if you look at a lot of the statistics, and even just look at pictures of a lot of these people migrating into Europe now, supposedly coming from Syria, but also from West Africa, coming from Central Asia, it's like a lot of them are men. It's like you have able-bodied men migrating in the wrong direction. Very, very strange. Okay. And then there are the third category of people, and these are the people who have resolved, they've made the determination and resolve to migrate to Allah and His Messenger, and to give assistance to His religion and His people, but they die on the way, such as Abdullah bin Jundub, before they arrive in Medina, and then their reward is established by Allah, and He forgives them for their obedience, and He's merciful towards them, and Allah is the one who obligated Hijrah, and He's the one who forgives the sins, and He's the one who is merciful to His slaves out of His generosity and His bounty, if they are from those who have a true intention, a sincere intention, and they make it sincerely for Allah. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the most famous hadith, and this is the one I talked about in my first podcast about the hadith, the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi, that's episode 4, this hadith, that the actions are only by intentions, and every person has what he intended. Whoever's migration is to Allah and His Messenger, then his migration is Allah and His Messenger, and whoever's migration is for the sake of this world in order to obtain it, or for a woman in order to marry her, then his migration is towards whatever he migrated towards. And that you can see more about, I believe that would be episodes 4 and 5 of this podcast. I can links below. And I talked more about migration in episode 5. And that is the end of Imam Muhammad SAW commentary on these sets of ayahs. So we learn a lot here. We learned here about the obligation of migration, obligation of Hijrah in Islam, what the scholars have been saying about this throughout history, but also especially since 2001. And there are other practical things, and I got this from some other lectures I listened to. One was a lecture about it was a video by Stefan Molyneux about how Donald Trump saved Western civilization, but he brought up a few interesting articles about some of the just basic statistics here that people have done about this migration crisis. So we know the ruling. We've explained the ruling of migration in Islam. Migration in Islam is not from the Muslim world to Europe and the Anglosphere. Migration in Islam, what has been commanded, is in the opposite direction. You migrate to the Muslim world to protect your faith, preserve your faith. I also have on my blog specific rulings about migrating to Germany, migrating to France, living in Sweden, migrating to Germany, to Europe in general. And the answer is always the same. Don't go to France, don't go to Germany. Even if you're having difficulty, even if you are in a war zone, like certain parts of Syria, Libya, Iraq, whatever, try to go to another part of the Muslim world. Now, here are a few interesting statistics. One thing, I got an article here, which I'll put a link below. One statistic is that 65%, there's a professor of economics at the University of Munich, tells the German magazine Zeit that 65% of Syrian refugees fail to meet international standards on basic reading and writing skills. Okay. If these refugees are not even literate in their own language, i.e. Arabic, what are they possibly going to do in terms of employment in somewhere like Canada or Europe or America? What are they going to do? They're illiterate. Wouldn't it be better, and this is in addition to the ruling of Islam, the ruling that we just clarified, wouldn't it be better for people like this to settle in another Muslim country? To settle like somewhere like Jordan or Egypt, in another country where the people speak Arabic, where they're also Muslims, where the climate is the same, the culture is more or less the same. Wouldn't it be better for them? At least they can communicate. with the majority of people around them. So this is one statistic that's very, very scary. 65% of Syrian refugees failed to meet international standards on basic reading and writing skills. Just 10% of the 1 million arrivals, 10% of the 1 million arrivals in the country, this is Germany, this year, I believe this is referring to 2015, yeah, this is 2015, have a college degree, which may force unemployment rates and demand for social welfare to rapidly go up. See, welfare payments. This is what this means. It means that these people, they don't have job skills, they're not even literate. They're going to do what? If they're in Germany or France or Britain or Canada, what are they going to do? They're just going to live off welfare. And then here's another example I found here. In Sweden, this is an article from 2016. In Sweden, it says out of almost 163,000 people who applied for asylum in Sweden last year, less than 500 landed a job. 163,000 people applied for asylum in Sweden. 500 landed a job. So what are they going to do? They're going to have to rely on welfare. So, and the problem here, and this is something, I mean, I spent several years working with colleagues in Malaysia, translating and publishing books about the virtue of working. I mean, one of them I can link below is called Three Classics. Seeking Your Livelihood and the Common Good. I should forget the name of it. That's my own books. But there's books there like by Imam Hassan Shaybani, he's from about 1200 years ago. Kitab al-Kasb, Imam Ghazali, Adab al-Kasb. All these books about earning a living, about the virtue of earning a living. This is where nobility lies. That you work. You work with your own hands. I mean, there's a story of Umar ibn al-Khattab. He's the second caliph, the second Khalifa. And when he was ruling, and he was based in Medina, and he went into the masjid, into the mosque in Medina, and he noticed there was a man in the masjid. He was always there. He was always there, just sitting in the masjid, praying and reading Qur'an and doing acts of worship. And he asked, and this is mentioned. I read this. This is mentioned in the tafsir of Imam Sha'rawi, the great Egyptian scholar Imam Sha'rawi, and this is in his tafsir of Surah Al-Jumu'ah. He says, so Omar sees this man, and he says, who is providing for him? If he's in the masjid all day, he's obviously not. If he's in the mosque all day, obviously he's not working. He said, who's providing for him? And they said, oh, his brother. His brother, has some job, or he has some sort of stall in the market. His brother's providing for him. And Omar's immediate response was, "Huwa ben min," meaning the brother is more worshipful than him. The brother who has a job and he's providing for his family, providing for people, he's more worshipful. He is closer to Allah. So this is a disgrace. I mean, migrating to the lands of unbelief, leaving the Muslim world, living somewhere where your faith is at risk and at threat, and then not even getting a job, just sucking off the system. So it's two shames, two forms of absolute disgrace. And another article I came across here, which I'll put the link below, is how much it costs. Right? It's actually so much. It's actually costly, because if we look at the fact that a lot of these people, like I mentioned, a lot of these refugees will be living off of welfare. Demographer Karen Ziegler and Director of Research Stephen Camarota analyzed the actual costs associated with resettling refugees from that region, i.e. the Middle East, in the United States. They said, although we do not consider all costs, our best estimate is that in their first 5 years in the United States, each refugee from the Middle East cost taxpayers $64,370, 12 times what the UN estimate it costs to care for one refugee in neighboring Middle Eastern countries. The researchers pointed out, noting that most refugee families take full advantage of American welfare benefit programs, including food stamps, 91%, and cash assistance, 68%. So the report states that on average, each Middle Eastern refugee resettled in the United States cost an estimated $64,000, $370 in the first 5 years, or $257,000, $481 per household. Compare this with $1,057 requested by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to care for each Syrian refugee family in most countries neighboring Syria. So even in simple basic financial terms, economic terms, the benefit lies in staying in the Muslim world, in a Muslim country. The religion will be the same, the culture will be the same, the language will be similar, because I know Arabic dialect changes from country to country, I know that. But even on those grounds, it's better. And it really, we should ask, like, why are these politicians in the West, why are they pushing for this? It's just virtue signaling. Look at me, I'm so kind, I'm so generous, I'm bringing all these people over. But once they get there, what are they going to do? It's not their language, it's not their culture, it's not even their climate. It's completely alien environment to them. Their job prospects are minimal, assuming they exist in some cases. They're somewhere between non-existent and very, very minimal. What are they going to do? They're just going to spend their life on welfare. And that's just looking at it just from a purely practical standpoint. And then from a religious standpoint, you've got the fact that you're migrating outside of Dar al-Islam to Dar al-Kufr, and you're not getting a job. So disgrace plus disgrace. So I think that is all the points I wanted to make on this issue. But this is very, very crucial to understand, and it goes back, and I do believe this is linked to something I also said, an article I put up last year about cultural Marxism. I think that this is connected. This is Muslims being used and exploited for a greater agenda, a greater demonic agenda. And if it's for Muslims to always look at causes, that's something I've said again and again on my blog. There are so many quote unquote good causes are presented in the mainstream media, and they're presented through academia and so forth. And Muslims tend to, we have this, especially in the West and in the Anglosphere, just to like sort of swallow it whole and think, okay, well, I'll just go along with it. Whether it's global warming, the global warming scare, whether it's the European Union or something, you just assume that it's a good thing because it's described as good, but you don't step back and look at, okay, well, who's funding this? Who's benefiting from this? Who's pushing this? What would be the long-term consequences of such an idea or such a policy? Where is this coming from? So, and as a final point, I mean, and all these ideas come under under the rubric of globalism. This is this ideology of globalism, this idea of globalization and creating some sort of global world order. And Muslims are being sucked into it and abused and exploited and used for these ends. And it's really our duty to sort of wake up and think about this. Wake up and think about this and question this. Is this really something we want to be a part of? Is this really something that we want to allow ourselves to be sucked into? We need to be thinking about this, because this is not good stuff. This is not good stuff. So I will put some more links below for people to look at. But I think I've made it very clear what the ruling is, and I think we should really bear in mind that globalism, I think the last point I want to say, it just comes back to me now. Globalism is an ideology that is now being rebelled against. It's being rebelled against because people are realizing that it's not beneficial for them. And this is why the British people voted to leave the European Union. This is why Donald Trump won so resoundingly over Hillary Clinton. This is why non-centrist parties in Europe, even if they're not winning elections, they're certainly gaining more numbers. Because people want to go back to national sovereignty, borders, and stuff like that. So and Muslims, if you're going to be, if Muslims aren't allowed themselves to be caught up in this globalist conspiracy, for want of a better word, then Muslims are going to suffer the backlash. So my final advice to Muslims, if you're living out there in Europe or the Anglosphere, follow the advice of the scholars that they've been giving since 2001. Try to move to the Muslim world. If you can't, try to stay out of the mainstream. Because again, I've gone over the categories of people. So if you can leave, go to the Muslim world. If you can't, stay out of the mainstream. Stay away from the big organizations. Stay away from the big masjids, the big mosques. And just be patient. Just stay out of the mainstream. Do not ask your governments for special favors or for handouts, or don't become dependent on welfare. Just stay out of the mainstream, stay out of the way, and if you can, when the time comes and you have the means, get out. That's my advice, and with Allah alone is every success. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.